Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. I appreciate the fact that you're watching. So today we're going to talk about what we do when things go wrong, how we can prepare for that. But before we do that, just a couple of quick housekeeping things, a couple of quick announcements. No live class next week, although we will have our current module due on Thursday. Yes, I know that's during spring break, but if you can, maybe go ahead and get it done today or tomorrow and get that turned in, then you won't have to worry about it. It's all good. Get it done early and you don't have to worry about it. Spring break is also a good time to get caught up if anybody's behind. So I recommend, if you're able, if you have the time, to take spring break as an opportunity maybe for those of you who are just a little bit behind to maybe try to get caught up. Well, you don't have to worry about coming to class for a few days. So today we are going to be talking about disaster recovery, but first I wanted to kind of show you all something and talk about something because I know it's probably been in the news and been in front of you. So I figured I'd take a few minutes here and talk about the Twitter recommendation algorithm that had been put out there, open sourced. Which is, it's pretty interesting, right? Last week we were talking about analysis on the back end and of our analytics, and we mentioned how different algorithms might impact us in terms of how we share our content, and by and large, algorithms and how they are structured on the back end are a mystery to us, right? We don't really know how exactly these organizations, these companies are recommending our posts, showing things in our feeds, what have you. And so Twitter just decided to put it out there, open source it. And this is it. I have the GitHub pulled up here. And so I just want to kind of look at this. My programming students know that an algorithm is just the steps it takes to solve a problem, right? So when we talk about an algorithm in this sense, we're going to see something that's very complex here when we're looking at this. We're going to see a very complicated algorithm that involves a lot of different steps and involves a lot of planning, but really at the end of the day, all that's happening here is that, there's a series of steps that have been taken to solve a problem, and the problem that's been put before Twitter here is, well, how do we recommend tweets? How do we recommend content? How do we put things on that For You tab? How do we enhance voices? That sort of stuff. And so that's what we're looking at here. And the first thing to look at here is this image. And this image here shows us basically how the major services of Twitter interconnect in a graphical format, right? And some of these things you might be familiar with, and some of these things you are probably lesser familiar with or completely unfamiliar with, because when we're looking at the features and the candidate sources here, what we're looking at are technologies that are on the back end of Twitter that are doing various different types of things. But the data up front is our input, right? And this all kind of gets back to our data cycle that we've talked about several times again as well. Right? You have an input, and in this input, it's looking at a social graph, it's looking at tweet engagement, right? And we've talked about engagement a lot. As we're moving people down that funnel, we've talked a lot about engagement. So when we're talking about engagement, we're talking about likes and shares and retweets in this case. If there's a graphic or an image, how many times that's been clicked on or utilized and so on, just how many different ways people have interacted with our posts. And then user data, just information about the user just in general. What type of user are they? What background do they come from? Are they an elevated VIP type of user? So on and so forth. Right. So we see these three sources of data that get put into this workflow. And these three different sources of data go through the technologies. And these technologies here are ones that we won't get into, right? These are more complex proprietary technologies that Twitter have. But from there, it gets put into the different tech stacks, gets run through the different sources and processes. And then we have this here that they're calling the heavy ranker. And so it's at this point here when we're getting into the algorithm. The algorithm of how it's choosing to rank tweets. And it has a list of heuristics here that it builds out of those algorithms, that it builds out of that heavy ranker process. And these are social proof, author diversity, visibility, content balance, and feedback fatigue. And from there, it takes all of the recommendations based off of those 5 big categories and uses them to suggest who to follow, uses them to put ads on your timeline, and uses the organization of the timeline to try to determine what you want to see. Right, so there's a lot going into the Twitter algorithm, and this is reflexive of what we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. What we see is the back end, the analytics. We see the after. And this is what's going on behind the scenes while all that information is being generated, while all that's happening. Right? Because it's taking these things like social proof and visibility, which has a lot to do with, the analytics that we see. And it's using these things to make determinations about other things that we might want people to see or that Twitter wants people to see. Right, so we can look at that and we can look at the actual code here. And the part that I want to look at specifically, right, there's a ton of code in this. Majority of it's Scala, right? Because as we saw here, there are several different technologies that are included here. So it's written in several different languages, Scala, Java, a little bit of Python, a few other languages, right? So we can look in, I want to look here at source and I want to look at timeline ranker. So let's go into timeline ranker here and just read about this technology and what this does. So this is a legacy service. So this is a service that they may not be maintaining as much anymore. It used to be the backbone of kind of the way tweets were ranked and scored. And it provides tweets a relevance score. And so at this point, it's old, it's antiquated, right? Even though it's called Timeline Ranker, it's a legacy service, and it's not built in much anymore. But we can actually look at the code here. I actually think I want to see the model here to see the different things that are going on. So like if I looked here at, let's say candidate tweet.scala. This is some Scala code that's working on the back end. And so this looks incredibly complicated. Like there's a lot of code here. I mean, it is fairly complicated, right? Because you can see we're also, even though there's not a whole bunch of lines of code here, this references several other uh, modular code bases that are in other files and brings them in. So what we can see here is that we're creating a variable that is a tweet object, graph_scala.tweet equals candidate.tweet.getRL, which is interesting. And then we can see that, if it has a tweet, then it does a thing. If it doesn't have a tweet, then if it has a tweet, it runs candidate tweet, the candidate tweet function on it. And if it doesn't have a tweet, it throws an exception, right? So that's just an example. This is one of those situations where, when I get to talking about things like, you learn to code, and then when you see other bits of code, like, you can make sense of it, right? So there's a lot of stuff to look through here. Like, if we actually wanted to sit here and go through all of it and try to make sense of it, it would take us a long, long time. I just kind of more want you all to get an idea of, what's going on behind the scenes. So if we look at the source now, this would be more modern source here, and we can look in maybe some more language that we're familiar with, like the Java search system here. And so this is more of a currently used algorithm that Twitter's using here. And this is ranking and indexing based searches in particular. And so it gives you some examples of use cases here, how it looks at different, based on different search terms. And if we go into the code, we can see all sorts of stuff. Let's see if we can pick out a good one here, one that would actually have stuff in it. Let's try query cache result per segment. Let's see here. Got an object. This is actually so this is just putting it into cache. That's the build file that lets you know what all it's using. All sorts of stuff here. It's interesting to look at. If you have the time, if you're willing to sit down and pore over it, there's a ton of stuff here. For your purposes, if you'd like to look this over, more so what I would recommend than anything would be just sitting down and kind of reading some of the README files. Because I think these README files give you a good indication of what's going on inside of the folder and all this kind of stuff. And then if you want to look at the code and you want to see some more practical applications of the code, then you can actually drill down into the code and look at the code. There's a lot of pull requests being made and a lot of issues being tagged, which is going to be natural based on what this is and who's involved with it. But if you want to look at this for yourself, it is on github.com/Twitter/the-algorithm. So I recommend you all taking a little bit of time and checking it out if you if you want. Right? Not a big deal. Just something that I wanted to share just so you all can kind of see the other side of the analytics today, since we've been talking about analytics for a couple of weeks here. So let's move on to talking about social media disaster recovery and what we do when things go wrong. Whoops. What we do when things go wrong for social media disaster recovery. And so when we're thinking about social media in general, right, you've seen a lot of faux pas on social media, right? You've seen a lot of missteps. You've seen a lot of people make a lot of errors. These are, less than ideal, right? These aren't things that we want to do, but by and large, we're just going to have to accept that it's probably going to happen at some point, that we're going to encounter a situation where we make a bad choice, or we say the wrong thing, or we accidentally post a picture of something that we maybe shouldn't have. Right? There's a whole lot of things that could fall into this category of social media disaster. Right? And so when you have a disaster, and it's, it is sort of air quotes disaster, right? Like we use disaster because disaster recovery is a term utilized word here, but it's not really the end of the world. It might be the end of, at least for a while, all the hard work that you've done to grow a community and build a community around yourself, your brand, your products, your ideas, whatever you've got, right? So it's not a critical disaster, as all that sort of would work, but it's disastrous for business purposes. And really, when we're talking about social media disaster recovery, a large part of this is going to be just being proactive. If you've built a rapport and built a relationship in good faith with your community, then by and large, what you'll encounter is this idea that, your community really, they have your back, right? And even if you make a mistake, they know that you were operating in good faith. They know that, it was a mistake. You'll lose some people, but by and large, you'll be fine. So a lot of this is going to be proactivity and sort of getting out ahead of it. And so this is, we have the idea of public relations becoming a part of social media here. And I think in general, like we think about kind of PR and public relations as being kind of questionable. Right? Because it's like, oh, they're trying to do damage control, so they wheel out the PR team here. But public relations is really, it's more of a proactive thing to try to make sure that we're connecting with the right people. I mean, really trying to make sure we relate to the public in the right sort of way. Hence public relations. So when we're talking about public relations, what we're really talking about is the practice of managing the spread of information between an entity, right? Which when we're talking about an entity here, we're talking about you, your business, your organization, the government, whomever, and the public. Right? So oftentimes that's the reason that people use PR people, is so that they themselves aren't getting maybe emotional, overheated, angry, upset while making a statement. They funnel communications through a public relations person whose job it is to maintain a level head, to craft a statement that would be appropriate for the situation, and then deliver that information to the stakeholders, to the public, to your followers. And so really like we've talked a lot about how we can engage in good public relations, and it kind of gets back to that whole idea of what I talked about there of kind of getting out ahead of it and showing your audience that you operate in good faith. So if we're doing things up front, if we're doing things early on, we're targeting our brand or we're targeting our audience, we're staying on our brand message, right? We're not going to sway too far out of bounds with what our message is or what we want our message to be. So these are the big things when it comes to developing good public relations. If we are always kind of staying in our lane and talking about the things that we talk about in general, where we're still driving that content toward the audience, where we're still staying on the brand message, we are more often than not going to be fine. Right? It is typically when people start to kind of stray from the general brand message that things kind of get a little bad. Things are, you might say something, just saying something off the cuff that doesn't really work very well and gets you in a little bit of trouble. Right? That's not to say accidents can't happen if you are trying to stay on brand message and continuing to target your audience well, but they will be fewer and further between, right? And so really most of the duties of public relations have to do with your reputation, building it and maintaining it. Right? Like we want to make sure that we are, utilizing good PR, that we have good public relations, that we're building good relationships between ourselves and our community. And we want to ensure that, as we're building these relationships, we're also building our reputation. We want people to see us as the people that we think we are ourselves. Right? So this does dovetail nicely into the next module, which talks about ethics. So public relations is an upfront thing. Damage control, on the other hand, is what happens reactively. So if we say public relations is proactive, damage control, on the other hand, is reactive. It's about minimizing the negative perception of your brand caused by a crisis situation. So what exactly is a crisis? Or a crisis situation? And a lot of people think that crises are all just unexpected, that they just happen out of nowhere. And some of them do, but some of them are expected. Right? Like if say for example, you have a timed deadline for when you want to release something and you have to delay that release. That's a crisis that would be expected, right? Like we know that we're going to have to delay this, and we know that when we tell our audience that we're going to have to delay this, we're going to receive some backlash on it. It's not going to go well for us. Right? So having some forethought behind how certain actions might be perceived really can prepare us for a potential crisis and allow us to get out ahead of it. So in that example there, right, when we've missed our deadline for something that was supposed to be some sort of time-released piece of media, what can we, if we know that this is going to happen, what can we do to get out ahead of it and communicate that it's going to happen? Is there any sort of an intermediary item that we can offer in the meantime? Is there anything that we can do to calm people down? Is that just being transparent with our audience? Really, it could be, right? It could be that. So there are times when a crisis can be expected. There are also times when a crisis is unexpected. A completely unexpected event. And so when you think a crisis might be coming up, or a crisis is going to be coming up based on just the facts of a situation, that's kind of easy, right? Because you know what you're going to be doing, or you know what's going to be happening, and you can act on them accordingly. But if you don't know that it's going to happen, if you don't know that there's going to be a particular social media issue, then you should probably have a plan in place that is a little more generic, that could happen, that you could utilize for many different situations that could help you get out of a jam, right? So we want to have some kind of crisis plan in place that we can quickly pick up and adopt the processes whenever we're faced with an unexpected hit to our PR, an unexpected crisis in this sort of way, right? Because if we don't, then we won't have the processes in place. We won't know what to do if/when that event happens. And the longer that it takes us to recover from an incident like that, as long as it takes us to get out on it and try to improve our status, the more we'll lose our audience, the less likely we'll have to get our audience back, so on and so forth. So ideally then, if we know we need to have a plan in case a crisis happens, really our best and first course of action is to try to avoid crisis in the first place, right? I mean, and this is impossible, right? We can't always avoid a crisis, but we can create an environment in which we can minimize the opportunity for crises to occur, right? So I think that is super important as we're looking at different situations. So in this instance, right, even if you are not on the social media team of an organization, your participation on social media could be the catalyst for a potential crisis for an organization, for a company. Right? And so in turn, these companies will make policies that, like, oh, you're not supposed to use whatever, right? So we want to try our best to avoid crisis before it hits us. And so ways that we can do that, one is to not make promises you can't keep. I mean, that's the easiest way to get an audience to turn on you, is to make a promise and then immediately walk that promise back, or have that promise go unfulfilled. I mean, we see situations like that, like, the one of the more recent Logan Paul scandals, for example, the Crypto Zoo scandal. A lot of the people that bought into that, a lot of the audience for that, didn't feel like it was a scam until they never saw a return on promises that were made to them. right? There were promises about the game, promises about the currency. People knew up front that it might be, could be, a way for a small select group of people to make a lot of money off the backs of others. But because, there's an individual who built up a bit of rapport, built up a relationship with their audience, they're going to give them the benefit of a doubt. And promises were made, but promises were not kept. And so that breaks that trust, that breaks that reputation. And so not only does that make your audience more likely to get mad at you in the short term, it's going to make them less likely to support you in other ventures in the long term. Because when you try to propose something new, all they'll be able to remember is how they were hurt before. Right? So there is that. Keep the conversation focused. Again, just stay in your lane. Whatever you've decided to talk about. It's when you decide to kind of follow these side pathways that you can open yourself up to different types of criticism. So if you can keep the conversation focused, it can help you prevent having an issue, but it can also help you to get past an issue very quickly, right? Just stay on the issue and address it and resolve it. Acknowledge the negative feedback, right? You don't have to implement it, but you do, or you should acknowledge it, right? When your audience is invested in the way that we've been discussing, kind of getting an audience invested, and there's things going on in their community that don't seem quite right, they're going to have an opinion on it. And, it might not be feedback that you can implement, or you might know that it's not wise for you to implement this feedback. But you at least need to acknowledge them and maybe give a little bit of an explanation as to why. Right? Like there are certain companies where they change things all the time, and it's just part of life that company is in flux, and they're always kind of changing what they do or who they are or how everything works. And by and large, since they've established expectations, you don't see as much negative feedback on change. You see a little bit, but you don't see as much because a particular level of expectations has been established. And when there is some negative feedback, they can say, well, we changed this. We did that for this reason. And we think that's going to help everybody in the long run. Okie dokie. Maintain control of your emotions. It's really easy to get angry and upset when bad things happen. And we want to make a plan and have a plan in place, know the processes that we want to use in the event that something does go wrong. And if we don't feel like we can handle it ourselves, we should hire somebody else, right? Somebody whose job it is to, be that public relations person, to keep themselves siloed, to maintain the focus on the conversation, to acknowledge the negative feedback, to have controlled emotions, to build the plan, to basically do all of the other parts of the bulleted list here. Hire somebody to do that. When you're a small social media creator, that's going to be incredibly challenging to do, if not impossible. But it is something to consider if you are having a lot of these issues. Now you'll notice that one of those tips was controlling your emotions. And I think this is a big social media blunder that we see made a lot, right? People just getting mad, and then as a result of them getting mad, they just go off, go on a little tweet storm, go on a little tirade, make a response video that's angry, and just take it out on everybody. Right? And so that's going to have a bigger, quicker, more adverse effect on your brand than anything else. This kind of going off and tweeting angry and incoherently, probably, or, angry posting, if you will. So it's important for us to remember just a handful of strategies to handle conflict. One is to don't take it personally. It's going to seem incredibly personal, right? So, you might hear me say, like, oh, don't take it personally, and think, well, that's easy for you to say. Don't take it personally. Of course I'm going to take it personally. I put a lot of time, I put a lot of energy, I put a lot of effort. I remember several years ago, I was a media creator, content creator for a project. And I had somebody in that wasn't the usual voiceover person, but I had somebody in to do a voiceover for me for a video. And they had a really thick Southern accent. And, that's all well and good, right? I don't have an issue with it. I can understand a Southern accent fairly well. But, one of the issues becomes, well, if this is going to be a video that is seen nationally or internationally, then all of a sudden you don't have an accent, you have a dialect that is going to be harder for certain people to understand. And of course, there was a comment or two in the YouTube comments about the person's voice. Right? And, your voice is not something that you can change. Right? I mean, you can a little bit. Like, you can do specific things to work on specific things. But at the end of the day, your voice is your voice. Right? And just getting somebody different with a bit of a different personality and a different idea and a different perspective was beneficial. So, the intonation of their voice didn't really matter to me. And so it was important for them not to take things seriously in that moment. Right? Because if they really wanted to, they could have gotten mad about it. They could have replied back. But it was important for us to kind of maintain a level head, laugh it off a little bit even. Because, there's nothing wrong with it. It was fine. But if it was taken personally and escalated, then some bad things could happen. Ensure that there's a very clear channel in which your community can engage. Right? One of the biggest mistakes that people make is to just shut down comments. Right? Because that's just going to make people angrier toward you and your brand. Leave the video open, leave the comment section open, let people get their, let people vent and get their frustrations out. Then maybe, in a couple weeks when everything's calmed down, go in, delete that video, delete that tweet, whatever, right? Remove it from the face of the earth. So people, a year, 5 years, 10 years from now can't go back and see all that negative feedback. But really, like, what you're doing when you're not giving an individual an outlet to provide feedback, whether positive or negative, is it's like you're taking a bottle of soda or a can of soda and you're just shaking it. You're just shaking it up. Right? And so all that carbonation, all that pressure is building up on the inside of the container. and it doesn't have anywhere to go. So when it finally finds a place to go, it erupts, right? It spews everywhere. So if you have clear channels that your community can engage in, for example, like one thing that I've heard of that I've heard of happening before, that is a result of not having these clear channels, as well. They had communications cut off of their own videos and their own social media, like their business social medias. But people knew the names of people who worked for that company, and they were able to find their personal social medias and their personal channels, right? And then they could, in turn, since the situation's been escalated by not allowing them to express themselves, it starts to spew out in other directions, like these personal channels and personal accounts, which is less than ideal. These people just work there, and now they're, facing what seems like harassment as a result. So you want to make sure that, there's a clear channel in which your community can engage, they can comment, they can post, and you want to try to keep it off of individuals within your company, right? Again, you don't necessarily want that material staying there forever. So you can leave it up for a week or two, wait until everything calms down, and then just quietly get rid of it. It'll be fine. Ensure that feedback, opinions, and ideas are discussed, considered, and engaged with, right? So it's more than just giving them the opportunity to vent and get things out, but, responding and engage in discussions and engage in comments. And this is another good role for your PR person, maybe somebody who is less emotionally connected to the situation, right? Because, this is a situation where you are potentially talking to another human being. So if you escalate the situation at that point, it's just going to get worse. Right? And finally, we want to always ensure that you and or your staff members are publicly engaging and not hiding in private communication channels. Now, there are certain situations where you can't say specifics because of legal reasons, right? Like if it's a crime, if it's an ongoing situation that's occurred, you can't give all the details because it's an ongoing investigation. But you do want to be as transparent and as public as possible with the things that have occurred. That is within reason, right? As we've kind of talked about, multiple times throughout the semester, your audience, the people you are trying to appear to, are going to appreciate that transparency. And at the end of the day, it's going to be something that, can help you build back to some degree the element of trust that you might have lost during the process. And so as you're thinking about the processes and the things that you're going to want to do to deal with a social media incident for yourself, these are all really huge things to talk about. And so that is all that I have for you for today. We'll go ahead and wrap up here. As we're wrapping up, if anybody who's here with me live in the chat has any questions for me, please put them in the chat. We'll answer them to the best of our ability. If you have some time, go check out that Twitter algorithm. See if you can make heads or tails of it. Just interesting to kind of flip through and see what you can find. But with that being said, and since I'm not seeing any questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Once again, thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.